Hey guys, tonight we're stepping away from the well-lit halls of history and into the shadows, where myth and memory intertwine. We're exploring the story of an order that became a legend, a name that conjures images of crusading knights in white mantles, of immense, hidden treasure, and of tonight. We delve into the world of the Knights Templar. They were the ultimate paradox, devout monks who were also elite soldiers, pious men of God who became the world's first international bankers, and finally, celebrated heroes of Christendom who were hunted down, tortured, and burned as heretics. Their rise was spectacular, but their fall was... If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you... For now, just get comfortable. Let the world outside settle down, and let's journey back to a time of faith, gold, and fire, to uncover the entire story of the Knights Templar. To understand how a knight could also be a monk, you first have to understand the world that needed them. Let's travel back further, before the betrayal, before the treasure, to the turn of the 12th century. The air in Europe was thick with a fervent, almost feverish faith. The First Crusade had just ended, a brutal and bloody success that had wrested Jerusalem from Muslim control and established 4 Christian states in the Holy Land. For the first time in centuries, and so they came. Pilgrims from every corner of Europe, noble and peasant alike, answered a deep, spiritual call to walk the same dusty ground that Christ had walked. They sold their lands, left their families, and embarked on a perilous journey that spanned thousands of miles. But reaching the Holy Land was not the end of their ordeal. It was often the beginning. The roads connecting the port cities on the coast to the sacred sites, inland Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the River Jordan were treacherous. Bands of brigands and hostile raiding parties haunted the arid hills and narrow mountain passes, preying on the weary and the vulnerable. A journey undertaken for the salvation of one soul could easily end in robbery. Enslaved, the newly formed Kingdom of Jerusalem had too few soldiers to guarantee safe passage. There was a void, a desperate need for a permanent force to protect these faithful travelers. The world didn't just need more soldiers, nor did it need more monks praying in monasteries. It needed something new, something that lived in both worlds at once. It was in this crucible of faith and danger, in the sun-scorched and blood-soaked landscape of the Holy Land, that a small group of 9 knights conceived of a truly radical idea. They would not fight for wealth or land, but for God. And they would protect His people, not with prayers alone. Now, let us move forward in time. 2 centuries have passed. The world has changed. The radical idea of those 9 knights has blossomed into a global powerhouse. The Knights Templar are no longer a small, impoverished band of brothers. They are now the wealthiest and most powerful organization in all of Christendom, second only to the papacy itself. Their red-crossed banners are known in every kingdom. Their network of farms, vineyards, and fortresses or preceptories spans the entire continent, but their home, the Holy Land, has been lost. In 1291, the city of Acre, the last Christian stronghold, fell, and so the Templars returned to Europe, not as conquering heroes, but as a military force without a war to fight. They settled into their new role as bankers and administrators, managing their immense wealth from their imposing temples in Paris and London. They were masters of logistics, finance, and diplomacy. Kings entrusted them with their treasuries, and nobles relied on them for loans. But with this power came a dangerous cocktail of envy and suspicion. To the common person, Their secrecy was unnerving. To the local nobility, their exemption from taxes and laws was infuriating. They answered to no king, only to the Pope. They had become a state within a state. And their arrogance, whether real or perceived, it is here, in the early 1300s, that our story truly finds its villain. Not a sultan in a distant land, but a king at the very heart of Europe. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair for his handsome features, not his sense of justice. He was a man driven by two unyielding ambitions to forge France into a powerful, centralized state, and to fill its perpetually empty coffers. And, as he looked around his kingdom, he saw one organization that stood in the way of both. An order that was impossibly wealthy, internationally powerful, and conveniently located right in his backyard. The Templars had survived the deserts of Syria, but they were about to face a far more dangerous foe, a determined king who saw them not as savior. A decision was made in the cold, quiet chambers of the royal palace. A point of no return was crossed, not on a battlefield, but in the hushed scratch of a pen on parchment. Throughout the summer of 1307, King Philip's machinery of state began to move in absolute secrecy. Sealed letters bearing the king's royal authority were dispatched to his agents, his seneschals and baillis, in every district of France. The instructions inside were precise, chilling, and to be read only on a specific date. All across the kingdom, life continued as it always had. The autumn harvest was being gathered, and the air was growing crisp. In the Templar preceptories, the warrior monks followed their ancient rhythm of prayer and duty. They managed their farms, audited their accounts, and trained for a war they no longer fought, all while oblivious to the web being meticulously woven around them. In Paris, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, an aging veteran of the Crusades, had recently served as a pallbearer at the funeral for Philip's sister-in-law. He was an honored guest in the king's court, completely unaware of the storm gathering just behind the palace walls. He, and all that trust, was the fatal flaw in their armor. As the sun set on that Thursday, hundreds of royal agents across France broke the seals on their orders. The command was simple and absolute at dawn. They were to raid every Templar property simultaneously, arrest every knight, squire, and servant, and seize all assets in the name of the king and the church. There was to be no warning, no resistance, no escape. It was a perfectly synchronized, kingdom-wide strike. The trap was set. As the Templars slept, the king's men sharpened their swords, ready to bring down an empire. The arrest sent a shockwave across Christendom. For a secular king to arrest and imprison an entire military order of men who were answerable only to the Pope was an audacious, almost unthinkable act of power. King Philip knew he had overstepped his authority. The Templars were the Pope's soldiers, and only the Holy See had the right to judge them. To justify his actions, Philip needed more than just confessions. He needed the Church's stamp of approval. Clement was in a difficult, almost impossible position. A Frenchman himself, he owed his papacy in part to Philip's influence, and he had even moved the papal court from the chaos of Rome to Avignon in France, a decision that left him vulnerable and geographically within the king's shadow. When news of the arrests reached him, Clement was initially outraged. He saw Philip's move for what it was, a brazen usurpation of papal authority. But his outrage was met with a flood of damning evidence from Philip's court, dozens of signed confessions. The Pope was trapped. To deny the confessions would be to risk being accused of harboring heretics himself, a dangerous charge in a time of religious zeal. To accept them would be to condemn an order that had faithfully served the Church for 2 centuries and to surrender his authority to a secular king. This was the true battleground now. Not in the dungeons, but in the political arena. Philip had ignited a fire, and now he was handing the reins to Clement, forcing him to either legitimize the flames or be consumed by them. The fate of the Templars no longer rested on their innocence or guilt. It rested on a political power struggle between a relentless king and a compromised pope, a struggle that would seal. Our story begins properly, not in a king's court or on a battlefield, but in the quiet, sun-beaten heart of Jerusalem, around the year 1119. Picture the city then, a place of profound holiness and profound danger. The cobbled streets, recently reclaimed for Christendom, were filled with a current of languages and prayers. But beyond the safety of its walls, the roads were lawless. For the thousands of pilgrims who had risked everything to be there, it was in this atmosphere that a French nobleman from the Champagne region, a knight named Hugues de Payens, saw not just chaos, but a calling. He was a veteran of the First Crusade, a man who had seen both the glory of faith and the grim reality of its cost. He watched as pilgrims, who had traveled for months, were slaughtered or enslaved just miles from their sacred destination. To him, this was an unacceptable failure. Gathering 8 other knights to his cause, among them a Fleming named Godfrey de Saint-Omer, Hugues proposed a new kind of brotherhood. They would not be lords of conquered lands. They would not seek wealth or titles. They would take the 3 monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, just like monks. But they would add a 4th unspoken vow to protect the roads with their lives. They presented themselves to King Baldwin II, the ruler of Jerusalem, and to the Patriarch, the city's highest religious authority. They offered their swords not in the service of conquest, but in the service of the king, desperate for any help he could get, granted them their wish. He gave them a space for their headquarters, a wing of the royal palace that stood upon a place of immense historical and religious significance, the Temple Mount. To the Crusaders, this site, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque now stood, was the very location of Solomon's Temple. And so, this small band of brothers, dedicated to protecting the weak, took their name from the sacred ground beneath their feet. They would be known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. For the first 9 years, their existence was humble, almost invisible. Legend holds they were so poor that Hugues de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer had to share a single horse, an image that would later be immortalized on their official seal, 2 knights riding on one steed, a symbol of their poverty and brotherhood. They owned nothing personally. Their clothes were donated, their food was given as alms. They patrolled the dangerous road from the port city of Jaffa to Jerusalem, a small, dedicated, but largely unnoticed fraternity. They accepted no new members during this time, remaining just 9 men bound by a sacred oath. They were an experiment, a strange hybrid of piety and violence, waiting in the wings of history. Few could have predicted that from this quiet, impoverished beginning, a global empire would one day rise. But the seeds had been planted. For nearly a decade, the Templars remained a small, obscure brotherhood, their grand vision struggling to take root. Hugues de Payens knew that to survive and grow, they needed more than just royal approval in a distant kingdom. They needed the ultimate seal of legitimacy the blessing of the Holy See itself. In 1127, he traveled from Jerusalem back to Europe, his mission to win the favor of the Pope and, crucially, to attract new recruits and donations for his fledgling order. He found a champion in the most powerful and respected churchman of the age. Bernard was a Cistercian abbot, a theologian, and a man of immense spiritual authority. His words could sway kings and inspire crusades. To him, the idea of the Templars was not a contradiction, but a divine innovation. He saw in them the potential for a new kind of knighthood, one that purified the violent secular world of chivalry by dedicating it to God's service. Bernard became the Templars' greatest advocate. His efforts culminated in 1129 at the Council of Troyes, in Hugues de Payens' home region of Champagne. Here, before the assembled cardinals, bishops, and abbots of the Catholic Church, the Knights Templar were officially recognized and sanctioned by the Pope. They were no longer a private band of volunteers. They were now an official order of the Church, with all the legitimacy and privileges that entailed. Bernard himself was tasked with drafting their code of conduct, a document that would become known as the Latin Rule. This was the blueprint for the Templar life, a strict and detailed guide. The Rule's 72 clauses painted a picture of a life of extreme discipline and austerity, a fusion of the monastery and the military barracks. A Templar knight was to own nothing. His clothes, his armor, his horse all belonged to the order. He was to live a life of complete chastity, forbidden from even kissing his own mother or sister. Their diet was simple. Meat was eaten only 3 times a week, and they ate their meals in silence, listening to a reading from Scripture. Their days were rigidly structured, divided between the 7 canonical hours of prayer and the hard, practical duties of a soldier training. They were forbidden the vanities of secular knights. There were no brightly colored clothes, no decorative plumes on their helmets, no gilded harnesses for their horses. They were to wear a simple white mantle, a symbol of the purity and chastity they had sworn to uphold. This stark white garment, later emblazoned with a bold red cross symbolizing their willingness to die for their faith, would become their iconic uniform, a terrifying sight to their enemies on the battlefield. In an influential essay, Bernard praised them as the new knighthood, contrasting them with worldly knights who fought for glory and wealth. A Templar, he argued, could kill an enemy of Christ without sin, as he was not committing homicide, but malicide the killing of evil itself. This powerful idea legitimized the concept of the holy warrior, and young men, tired with the vanity of secular life but still yearning for the purpose of the sword, flocked to join the order. The 9 poor knights were about to become an army. With the Church's blessing and a stream of new recruits, the Knights Templar transformed from a humble patrol into the most elite fighting force in the medieval world. On the battlefield, they were nothing short of terrifying. In an age when feudal armies were often a chaotic mix of undisciplined nobles fighting for personal glory, the Templars were a cohesive, single-minded unit, bound by their sacred vows and an iron will. They became the shock troops of the Crusade. Their appearance alone was a psychological weapon. Imagine it, a line of heavily armored knights, clad in the stark, white mantles that billowed like ghosts against the desert landscape. The blood-red cross emblazoned on their chests was a promise that they would not retreat, that they would not surrender, that they would fight to the last man for their faith. Their faces, framed by chainmail coifs and often full, untrimmed beards as their rule dictated, were grim and resolute. They fought under a simple black and white banner known as the Beauseant, and its name became their battle cry. When the Templars raised the Beauseant and prepared to charge, both allies and enemies knew the turning point of the battle. Their signature tactic was the disciplined cavalry charge. Where secular knights might break rank in a pell-mell rush for glory, the Templars moved as one. They would advance slowly at first, a silent, menacing wall of steel and faith. Then, at the perfect moment, a command would be given, and they would unleash a single, thunderous charge, a tightly packed wedge of lances and armored war horses that smashed into enemy lines with unstoppable force. Their rule was explicit. No Templar was to break formation or retreat from battle unless the odds were worse than 3-1, or a direct order was given by their commander. To do so meant expulsion from the order in disgrace. This meant they often fought to the death, a fanaticism that unnerved their Saracen foe. Their legend was forged in battles where they were vastly outnumbered. At the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, a small crusader force, including just 80 Templar knights, stood against the mighty army of Saladin, led by the young, leprous king Baldwin IV. The Crusaders were on the brink of annihilation. It was the Templar charge, a desperate, almost suicidal assault that shattered Saladin's personal guard and sent his entire army into a panicked retreat. It was a stunning, almost miraculous victory, and it was the Templars who were credited. But this ferocity came at a tremendous cost. The order bled heavily in the Holy Land. In some disastrous battles, like the Horns of Hattin, their entire contingent was wiped out. Grand masters were captured or killed in action with grim regularity, yet they never faltered. For every knight that fell, another would arrive from Europe, ready to take up the white mantle and ride into battle. They were more than just men. They were an institution, an unending river of faith and steel. And for nearly 200 years, the Knights Templar's power was not forged exclusively on the battlefield, though. In fact, their most lasting and revolutionary contribution to the medieval world had nothing to do with swords or castles, but with finance. As their reputation for discipline and integrity grew, they inadvertently solved one of the greatest challenges of the age. The problem was simple. A nobleman in England wishing to go on pilgrimage or crusade had to finance his journey. This meant carrying immense sums of gold and silver across thousands of miles of pirate-infested seas and bandit-haunted roads. It was an open invitation for disaster. A man could survive the journey only to lose his entire fortune just miles from his destination. The Templars, with their network of fortified preceptories scattered all across Europe and the Holy Land, were perfectly positioned to offer a solution. And imagine you are that nobleman. You go to the Templar Temple in London, a formidable fortress in the heart of the city. You deposit your wealth, with them your gold, your silver, even the deed to your estate. In return, the Templars give you not a heavy chest, but a simple piece of parchment, a letter of credit. This letter contains a secret cipher, a code known only to the order. You then travel light, carrying only what you need for the journey, your true wealth secured in this simple, unassuming document. Months later, when you arrive in the Holy Land, you walk into the Templar preceptory in Acre or Jerusalem. You present your letter. The Templar scribes check the cipher, verify its authenticity, and then, from their own vaults, it was the world's first international banking system. The Templars had essentially invented the traveler's check. This innovation was revolutionary. It made pilgrimages and trade infinitely safer and fueled the economies of both Europe and the Crusader states. But their financial services didn't stop there. Their reputation for being incorruptible, they were monks, after all, sworn to poverty, made their vaults the most secure places in the world. Soon, kings, queens, and even the Pope himself began using the Templars as their personal bankers. The French crown jewels were stored for safekeeping in the Paris Temple. The order managed estates for absent nobles, collected taxes for monarchs. They became the treasurers of Christendom, while individual knights were sworn to personal poverty, owning nothing but their simple robes and weapons. The order itself grew astoundingly, incomprehensibly rich. This was the great paradox of the Knights Templar. Their piety and integrity made them the most trusted financial institution on earth. But that same success planted the poisonous seeds of their own destruction. They were no longer just soldiers of Christ. They were a global corporation, a financial superpower with assets that dwarfed entire kingdoms, and powerful people, especially kings. The Templar banking system was merely the engine of a much larger enterprise. By the late 13th century, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ were, in reality, neither poor nor just soldiers. They were the masters of a vast economic empire, the first of its kind, that stretched from the misty shores of Ireland to the sun-scorched plains of Syria. At its peak, the order controlled thousands of properties across Europe. These were not just castles and fortresses. They were sprawling estates known as preceptories or commanderies, fully operational, and each preceptory was the world unto itself. It would typically include a chapel, living quarters for the knights and sergeants, stables and workshops. But surrounding this core was a massive expanse of farmland, vineyards, and forests, all worked by local laborers. These estates produced a river of revenue: grain from France, wool from England, wine from Spain. This immense wealth, generated in the peace of Europe, was all channeled toward a single purpose: to fund the endless, costly war in the Holy Land. They were a self-sustaining, multinational corporation with a military purpose, and their efficiency was legendary. To move their goods, their men, and their money, the Templars built and maintained their own fleet of ships, giving them control over vital sea lanes in the Mediterranean. They could transport a war horse from a farm in France to a stable in Acre. What made them truly untouchable, however, was their unique legal status. Through a series of special edicts from the Pope, known as papal bulls, the Templars were granted extraordinary privileges. They were exempt from all local laws and taxes. They answered to no king, no prince, and no bishop. Their only master on earth was the Pope himself. They could build their own chapels, bury their own dead, and even collect their own tithes in some areas, a right that made them deeply unpopular with the local clergy. The ultimate symbol of their power was the Paris Temple. This was not merely a church. It was a massive, walled fortress complex in the heart of one of Europe's greatest cities. Part monastery, part military headquarters, and part financial capital. The Paris Temple functioned as the central treasury for all of Europe. For decades, the kings of France had stored their state treasury within its impregnable walls, trusting the safety of their kingdom's finances to the very monks their descendant would later destroy. The Templars had reached the zenith of their power. They commanded armies, controlled economies, and answered to no one but God's representative on earth. They seemed invincible, a permanent fixture in the Christian world. But an institution that powerful, that wealthy, and that independent does not just make allies. It creates enemies, lurking in the shadows. Now, we must turn our gaze from the order to the man who would become its architect of ruined King Philip IV of France. History remembers him as Philippe le Bel, Philip the Fair, a name given for his handsome, almost unnervingly still features. But beneath the pleasing exterior was a will of cold iron. Philip was a new kind of monarch. He was not a charismatic warrior king like his predecessors. He was a quiet, calculating administrator, deeply pious in his personal life, but utterly ruthless in his pursuit of royal power. He inherited a kingdom, but he envisioned a modern state. To achieve this, Philip needed two things: absolute loyalty and vast sums of money. He was constantly embroiled in expensive wars, particularly with the English and the Flemish, and his treasury was in a state of perpetual crisis. Before he ever turned his eyes to the Templars, he had already established a clear and brutal pattern for raising funds. He repeatedly debased the kingdom's currency, creating economic chaos but filling his coffers in the short term. He had taxed the French clergy, leading to a furious and ultimately fatal clash with the powerful Pope Boniface VIII. He had arrested the Lombard bankers, seizing their assets. And in 1306, just 1 year before the Templars' fall, he had expelled all Jews from France, confiscating their property, and Philip's methods were consistent. Find a wealthy group within his borders that lacked the political or military power to resist, and then find a legal or moral justification to destroy them and absorb their wealth. As he looked around his kingdom, crippled by debt and yearning for absolute control, the Knights Templar must have seemed like the ultimate prize. They were his primary bankers, and he owed them a fortune. Wiping out the order would not only cancel his enormous debts, but would also allow him to seize their immense assets. Furthermore, their status as a transnational power, loyal only to a distant pope, was a direct challenge to his vision of a unified France. They were a state within him, but he couldn't simply march his army into the Paris Temple. The Templars were a holy order, protected by the Pope. A direct assault would be sacrilege and would risk plunging his kingdom into a war with the rest of Christendom. Philip needed a weapon so powerful it could shatter their papal shield. And he found it in the most toxic accusation of the Middle Ages heresy. If he could prove that the warrior monks were not soldiers of Christ, but secret servants of Satan, then their privileges would vanish. Their destruction would not be seen as an act of greed, but as a pious duty. It was a chillingly brilliant plan, a masterstroke of political theater that cloaked a king's ambition in the sacred robes of a holy inquest. The date has since passed into superstition, a day of ill omen and bad luck. But for the Knights Templar, it was not superstition. It was the apocalypse. Before the first rays of sunlight touched the spires of Paris, the trap, so carefully laid, was sprung. In a single, coordinated wave of chilling efficiency, King Philip's men moved across the entire kingdom. From the Grand Temple in Paris to the smallest, most remote farm in Provence, the scene was the same. A hard, rhythmic pounding on a wooden gate, the splintering of a door, the sudden, terrifying intrusion. The Templars were taken completely by surprise. They were warrior monks among the most formidable fighters in the world, but they were not prepared for a war in their own homes. They were woken from their sleep, pulled from their morning prayers, and arrested in the name of the king. There was no organized resistance. These men, who had faced down Saracen armies, were, in the end, loyal subjects of the French crown. They believed a terrible mistake had been made, a misunderstanding that would surely be corrected. So they laid down their arms and submitted to the king's authority, trusting in their innocence and the protection of the Pope. It was a fatal. In Paris, the grand prize was the temple itself, the fortress that served as the order's nerve center. Royal knights swarmed the compound, their steel armor clattering in the stone courtyards. They arrested the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, himself. Imagine the scene: an old man in his 60s, a veteran of countless campaigns, whose life had been dedicated to the defense of Christendom, being led away in chains from his own headquarters. He was not captured on a battlefield in glorious combat, but taken like a common criminal in the dark. By the end of that single morning, thousands of Templars had been captured. Knights, sergeants at arms, chaplains, and even the servants and farmhands who worked their lands were rounded up. They were not taken to church-run facilities, where they might have found some measure of protection. They were thrown into the king's own dungeons, dark, damp, and isolated cells where they would be cut off from the world, from their brethren, and from any hope of justice. As the doors of the dungeon slammed shut, a new phase of their ordeal began. The swift, public violence of the arrests was over. Now came the slow, secret violence of the interrogation. Philip did not just need their bodies. He needed to break their souls. And for that, he had his own set of tools. Once the Templars were secured in his dungeons, King Philip unleashed his second, and perhaps more powerful, weapon: the charges themselves. This was not a simple indictment of corruption or treason. The document that was read out in public and sent to the Pope was a meticulously crafted work of propaganda, designed to incite maximum horror and disgust in the hearts of a pious medieval public. It painted a picture of an order that was not just flawed, but demonic, a holy institution that was in secret. The first and most devastating charge was that of heresy. The king's inquisitors claimed that during the Templars' secret initiation ceremonies, new recruits were forced to deny Jesus Christ and spit, trample, or urinate upon a crucifix. To a 14th century European, this was an act of unimaginable evil, a direct pact with the devil. It was the ultimate betrayal of the faith they were sworn to defend. This accusation alone. But the list went on, growing more bizarre and salacious. It was claimed the Templars engaged in idol worship. In their secret chapter meetings, they were said to worship a mysterious bearded head, or an idol they called Baphomet. The name itself was alien and sinister. No one knew what it meant, which only fueled the public's fear. Was it a demon, a cat, a pagan deity? The inquisitors never produced such an idol, but the power of the accusation lay in its mystery. It conjured images of dark rituals. Then came the accusations of institutionalized immorality, designed to strip the knights of their saintly reputation and portray them as depraved. New recruits, it was said, were forced to engage in an obscene kiss, kissing their initiator on the base of the spine, the navel, and the mouth. The charges alleged that homosexuality was not only tolerated, but encouraged within the order. And it was claimed that Templar priests, when celebrating Mass, deliberately omitted the sacred words of consecration, making the holy sacrifice. Finally, there were the predictable, though less spectacular, charges of financial fraud and greed, which served to justify the king's seizure of their vast wealth. Taken together, the list of accusations was overwhelming. It was a complete and total character assassination. The Templars were accused of spitting on the cross they wore into battle, of worshiping the demons they were meant to fight, and of indulging in the very sins they had vowed to renounce. The narrative was set. The heroes of the Crusades were secretly monsters. And now, with the charges made public, the next phase began, hidden from the world in the stone bowels of the royal dungeons. Here, in the cold and the dark, King Philip's inquisitors set to their grim work. For the Templar Knights, this was a new kind of hell, one for which their lives as soldiers had left them completely unprepared. They were warriors, trained to endure the heat of battle and the pain of a clean wound. They were not prepared for the slow, methodical, and The process was systematic. A knight would be left in isolation for days, sometimes weeks, in a lightless, filthy cell. The constant darkness, the gnawing hunger, and the chilling damp were designed to break his spirit before his body was even touched. Then, he would be brought to the interrogation chamber. Imagine this space, lit by a single guttering torch that cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air would be heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and old blood. And in the center, the methods used were varied, but all were designed to inflict maximum pain without, if possible, killing the subject too quickly. A favorite of the inquisitors was the strappado. The knight's hands would be tied behind his back, and a rope would be slung over a beam in the ceiling. He would be hoisted into the air, the entire weight of his body hanging from his wrists, his shoulder joints shrieking as they were wrenched from their sockets. He would be raised and dropped repeatedly. If that failed to produce the desired answers, there was the rack. The knight would be strapped to a wooden frame, his ankles and wrists bound to rollers at either end. With each turn of a lever, the rollers would pull in opposite directions, slowly and inexorably stretching his body. He would feel his ligaments strain, his joints pop, his muscles tear. It was a slow, measured agony, a process of being deliberately dismantled, all while the inquisitor's calm voice repeated the same questions. Some had their feet greased with fat and held over a brazier of hot coals, the flesh blistering and burning as the questions were asked again and again. Under such unrelenting torment, even the most formidable warriors broke. Battle-hardened veterans who had faced death without flinching now wept and begged for mercy. They confessed. They confessed to everything, to spitting on the cross, to worshiping idols, to the obscene kiss, to any and all of the fantastical charges their tormentors demanded. Dozens of knights died during these interrogations. Those who survived were left physically and psychologically shattered. Their confessions, the keystones of Philip's case against the order, were not evidence of guilt. They were monuments to human suffering. Among the hundreds of knights languishing in Philip's dungeons, there was one whose confession mattered more than all the others. Combine that of Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He was the heart and soul of the order, its living symbol. If he could be made to confess, the entire institution would fall with him. Philip's inquisitors knew this, and they focused. Jacques de Molay was an old man approaching his 70s. His life had been the order. He was a veteran of the last desperate battles for the Holy Land, a man who had seen the dream of the Crusades die at the Siege of Acre. He was a soldier, not a scholar, a man of simple, steadfast faith, utterly unprepared for the sophisticated legal and psychological warfare now being waged against him. At first, he resisted fiercely, protesting the illegality of the arrests and appealing to the authority of the Pope. But the Pope was far away, and the walls of the dungeon were thick. For weeks, de Molay was subjected to relentless pressure. He was kept in isolation, weakened by a poor diet, and worn down by endless questioning. His inquisitors were masters of their craft. They would have shown him the signed confessions of his own knights, men he had led into battle, now broken and admitting to the most horrific sins. They would have told him that his brothers were suffering, that their torment would only end when he, their leader, admitted the truth. They presented his stubbornness not as a virtue, but as a selfish act prolonging the agony of his men. It was a terrible choice to place upon an old man's shoulders the honor of the order versus the... Sometime in late October of 1307, after weeks of this pressure, Jacques de Molay broke. The exact details of his interrogation are lost to history, but the result is not. Whether from the direct application of torture or from the unbearable psychological strain, he finally confessed. He did not admit to everything. He vehemently denied the charges of sodomy and idol worship. But he admitted to the core of the heresy charge. He confessed that during his own initiation into the order, it was a partial, nuanced confession, likely given in a desperate attempt to appease the king and save his order from complete annihilation. Perhaps believing that a minor sin could be repented and the order reformed. But Philip and his ministers cared nothing for nuance. They had what they needed. The Grand Master of the Knights Templar had confessed to heresy. The news was immediately trumpeted across France. De Molay was brought before theologians at the University of Paris to repeat his admission, his words sealing the public perception of the order's guilt. The foundation of the Templar Temple had cracked. With their leader's own words used against them, the resolve of many other knights crumbled, and the floodgates of confession opened wide. The news of the confessions, especially that of the Grand Master, reached the papal court in Avignon and placed Pope Clement V in an agonizing bind. His initial outrage at Philip's illegal arrests was now complicated by a mountain of signed documents detailing heresy. To the outside world, it looked as though a corrupt and blasphemous order had been festering within the church, and King Philip, in his piety, had been the one to expose it. The King of France had masterfully maneuvered the Pope into a corner. If Clement defended the Templars, he risked being branded a protector of heretics. If he condemned them based on Philip's evidence, he would... Clement was a cautious and political man, not a confrontational one. He knew he could not win a direct power struggle with Philip, who not only controlled the French military, but also held a psychological advantage Clement's predecessor. Pope Boniface VIII had died in humiliation shortly after being captured by Philip's agents. The threat was unspoken, but palpable. So, Clement chose a different path. He would not fight Philip's fire with fire. He would try to smother it with the slow... In November 1307, he made his move. He issued a papal bull titled Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, a document sent to every Christian king in Europe. In it, the Pope commanded them all to do exactly what Philip had done to arrest the Templars in their respective kingdoms and to seize their lands and assets, but to do so in the name of the Church. On the surface, it was a capitulation. The Pope was officially endorsing the arrests, but in reality, it was a brilliant political countermove. By making the Templar issue a Europe-wide church-led investigation, Clement was wresting control of the narrative away from Philip. The trial of the Templars would know. He followed this by establishing his own papal commissions to investigate the charges. The proceedings, led by the French Inquisition, were suspended. The knights were to be handed over to the Church's men, to be questioned by bishops and cardinals under the rules of canon law, not the brutal expediency of royal torturers. For the Templars, languishing in their cells, this must have felt like a miracle. A glimmer of hope had finally pierced the darkness. Their true master, the Pope, had finally intervened. They believed they would now have a chance to tell their side of the story, to retract the words forced from them by pain, and to receive a just hearing. The fate of the order, it seemed, was back in the hands of the Church. But the papal commissions began their work in 1310, and for the first time since their ordeal began, the Knights Templar were offered a chance to speak for themselves. The hearings, particularly the main one held in Paris, were a world away from the king's dungeons. Here, before the Pope's own representatives, the knights were asked a simple question: did they wish to defend their order? At first, there was a terrified silence. The men were shadows of their former selves, emaciated, scarred, and deeply traumatized. They knew that King Philip's agents were watching, taking note of every name. To speak out was an act of immense courage, a risk that could cost them everything. But then, one knight stepped forward, then another, and soon the terrified silence was broken by a flood of defiant voices. In the Paris hearings alone, nearly 600 knights volunteered to defend the order. They organized themselves, appointing spokesmen to argue their case. The most prominent among them, a knight named Pierre de Bologna, was an educated and eloquent man who began to systematically dismantle. A new, horrifying narrative began to emerge. Knight after knight took the stand, not to confess, but to recant. They bravely repudiated the confessions that had been tortured out of them. And in grim detail, they described the torments they had endured. They told the papal commissioners of being stretched on the rack until their joints were pulled from their sockets. They showed the scars on their feet from being held over burning coals. One night, Ponsard de Guissy testified that under torture, his feet had been burned so badly that the bones had fallen out when he was returned to his cell. They were creating an official record of King Philip's brutality, a counter-narrative of suffering that they passionately defended the rituals of their order. The spitting, they explained, was not an act of heresy against Christ, but a symbolic ritual meant to simulate the denial of Saint Peter, a test of obedience and humility, not a rejection of faith. They swore on the cross that the charges of idol worship and sodomy were vile and baseless lies, invented by their enemies. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed as if the tide was turning. The sheer number of knights defending the order, and the consistency of their testimonies about torture, was having an effect on the commissioners. The king's case, built on a foundation of pain and fear, was beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. The Templars were fighting their last great battle, not with swords, but with words. King Philip watched the proceedings of the papal commission with growing impatience and fury. His carefully constructed case, built on fear, was being dismantled by the courage of his victims. The truth was leaking out, and the Pope's investigators seemed to be listening. For a man like Philip, who did not tolerate obstacles, this was an unacceptable development. If the Church would not give him the verdict he desired, he would find another way. He decided to bypass the papal commission. He found his weapon in a cruel loophole of inquisitorial law. While the Pope's commission was investigating the order as a whole, Philip had one of his loyal appointments, the Archbishop of Sens, convene his own local church council. The Archbishop's task was not to determine the guilt or innocence of the order, but to pass judgment on individual knights within his diocese. And he would judge them on a new charge. The logic was as simple as it was vicious. According to the law of the Inquisition, any person who confessed a heresy and was shown mercy, but then later recanted that confession, was considered to have relapsed. This was deemed a far greater sin than the original heresy, as it showed a soul utterly beyond saving. The punishment for a relapsed heretic was automatic, and it was the Archbishop's Council moved with terrifying speed. They identified all the knights who had originally confessed under torture and had then bravely stood before the Papal Commission to retract those confessions. These men, the very leaders of the Templar defense, were summarily condemned. On a single day in May of 1310, 54 Knights Templar were loaded onto carts and taken to a field just outside the walls of Paris. There, they were given one final, terrible choice. They could save their own lives by reverting to their original, forced confessions, thereby admitting their guilt and the guilt of their order, or they could stand by their testimony of innocence and be burned alive. In a final, astonishing act of courage and loyalty, every single one of them refused to condemn the order. They chose to die in the flames rather than live with a lie. As the fires were lit, their prayers and cries, the message of the burning pyres was not for the dead, it was for the living. The effect was immediate and devastating. The defense of the order collapsed overnight. The hundreds of knights who had volunteered to speak fell silent, terrified into submission. Witnesses refused to testify. The Papal Commission was rendered impotent. Its proceedings a hollow formality. King Philip had reminded everyone who truly held power. He had extinguished the Templars' defiance with fire and sent a clear signal to the Pope himself. The fate of this order would be decided in France by him. Hope was now, with the defense silenced by fire, the fate of the Templars was all but sealed. The final act would play out at the Council of Vienne, a great gathering of the Church's most powerful figures, convened by Pope Clement in 1311. While the Council's official agenda was church reform and the planning of a new crusade, everyone present knew the real reason they were there, to deliver a final verdict. But even here, King Philip did not get the swift condemnation he had hoped for. Many of the bishops and cardinals, especially those from outside France, were deeply skeptical. They had seen the evidence from their own papal commissions and heard the stories of torture. They felt that the order, as a whole, had not been given a fair chance to defend itself. Voices rose within the council, demanding that the Templars be granted the right to speak, to present their case before the assembled body of the Church. The proceedings stalled. For a moment, it seemed that the Church's own legal traditions might yet... Philip of France, however, was not a man to be deterred by legal procedure. When he heard of the council's resistance, he resorted to his most trusted method of persuasion, brute force. In March of 1312, he marched with his army to the outskirts of Vienne, surrounding the town where the Pope and his cardinals were meeting. The message was clear and unambiguous. There would be no more delays, no more debates. The King of France was there to get the result he wanted, and the present, trapped between a resistant council and an armed, impatient king, Pope Clement chose the only path left to him, a path of political compromise that would sacrifice the Templars to save the unity of the Church. He would not allow a formal vote on their guilt or innocence, as he knew it might not go Philip's way. Instead, he invoked his supreme papal authority to act unilaterally. On March 22nd, 1312, he issued a papal bull titled Vox in Excelso. In it, Clement stated that the evidence gathered by his own commissions was not sufficient to convict the order of the crime of heresy according to canon law. He admitted there was not enough proof. However, he argued, the reputation of the Templars had been so thoroughly destroyed by the scandal, the public confessions, and the ongoing controversy that the order could no longer serve its purpose. Its name had become a source of shame, not pride. Therefore, he concluded, not for the crime of heresy, but for the good and welfare of the Church, he was officially and perpetually suppressing the order of the Knights Templar. He did not find them guilty. He simply erased them. It was a quiet, bureaucratic death, delivered not by a sword, but by the ink. With the stroke of a pen, the Knights Templar were no more. But their wealth, the vast network of farms, castles, vineyards, and the mountains of gold and silver stored in their vaults remained. This raised the most important and pressing question for the rulers of Europe: who gets the money? The order had been suppressed, but its assets were the single greatest private fortune in the medieval world. And Pope Clement, in an attempt to maintain a semblance of pious order, issued another bull, Ad Providam, which laid out the official plan. The wealth of the Templars had been donated over centuries for the defense of the Holy Land. Therefore, he decreed, it must continue to be used for that purpose. All Templar property, lands, and assets were to be transferred to the other great military order, their long-standing rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. On paper, it was a just and logical solution. The Hospitallers, but King Philip IV had not gone to all this trouble, only to hand over the prize to another military order he couldn't control. He had been occupying the Templars' properties in France for 5 years, and in that time, his agents had conducted meticulous inventories. Now, he presented the Pope and the Hospitallers with a bill. It was a colossal invoice for all the costs he had incurred during the investigation, the price of arresting the knights, of feeding them in his dungeons, of running the trials, and a hefty administrative fee for managing their estates. This bill was so enormous that it consumed a vast portion of the Templar assets in France. Furthermore, with the Templar order officially dissolved, the massive debts the French crown owed to their bank were simply cancelled. In a brilliant, ruthless stroke of accounting, Philip had this cynical strategy became the blueprint for other monarchs. In England, King Edward II, though initially reluctant and far less brutal in his methods, also seized Templar lands and was slow to hand them over to the Hospitallers, siphoning off much of the wealth for himself. In Spain and Portugal, where the Templars were largely found innocent and were still valued for their role in fighting the Moors, the kings were unwilling to let such valuable property fall into the hands of an outside order. Instead, they created new, local military orders, like the Order of Christ in Portugal, to absorb the Templar assets. The Knights Hospitaller, the official heirs, found themselves in a frustrating position. They inherited a hollowed-out empire. They received vast tracts of land, but often found them stripped of their cash, livestock, and valuables. They were also burdened with the new responsibility of paying pensions to the surviving Templar knights who were not executed and were allowed to live out their days in quiet retirement in various monasteries. In the end, the true victor was not the Church, and certainly not the Hospitallers. The winner was King Philip. He had crushed his rivals, solidified his absolute power, and filled his treasury. The Holy Crusade against heresy had ended, as it so often does. With the quiet, the order was gone, its wealth divided, and its members scattered or imprisoned. But 4 men remained, the highest-ranking leaders of the Knights Templar, their fate still hanging in the balance. For 7 long and bitter years, they had wasted away in King Philip's prisons. Among them were the 2 most important figures, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, and Geoffrey de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy. Their ordeal, which had begun in the pre-dawn darkness of 13. The day was March 18th, 1314. A scaffold had been erected in the bustling square before the great cathedral of Notre Dame. This was to be the grand finale of the Templar affair, a piece of political theater designed to give the entire saga a sense of final, official closure. The 4 old knights, frail and gaunt from their long confinement, were led out before the assembled crowd and a commission of 3 cardinals appointed by the Pope. Their task was not to retry the case, but simply to read the charges based on their earlier confessions, wrung from them under duress. The expected sentence was clear life imprisonment. In the eyes of the Church, they were repentant heretics. They had admitted their guilt, and so they would be granted the mercy of spending the rest of their natural lives in a monastic cell, in perpetual penance for their sins. It was to be a quiet, somber end to a tumultuous story. The cardinals began to read from a long scroll, their voices echoing across the square as they listed the litany of crimes, the denial of Christ, the spitting on the cross, the worship of the idol Baphomet. The crowd listened, a mixture of morbid curiosity and pious satisfaction on their faces. They were witnessing the final humiliation of the once proud order. Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny stood and listened, their heads bowed. They looked like broken men, relics of a forgotten age, waiting meekly for the inevitable. The cardinals finished the reading. The list of sins and blasphemies hung heavy in the air. All that was left was for the condemned to publicly reaffirm their guilt and accept their sentence. The book on the Knights Templar was about to be closed forever. The cardinals turned to the Grand Master, expecting a quiet nod, a mumbled acceptance. But they, and the entire city of Paris, were about to witness one final, astonishing. As the cardinal's voice fell silent, a hush settled over the square. All eyes were on the 4 condemned men, these ghosts from a fallen empire. The formalities were over. All that was required was their quiet submission. The cardinals turned to Jacques de Molay, expecting him to accept his fate. But the old Grand Master, who had stood silently for so long, lifted his head. The frailty seemed to fall away from him, replaced by a clarity and strength that no one expected. He, in a voice that was clear, steady, and loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, he did not mumble his acceptance. He shattered the carefully constructed narrative of the king. He declared that he knew he must die, and that he deserved death. But not, he boomed, for the fantastical crimes he had confessed to under duress. His true and terrible sin, he proclaimed, was the shameful act of lying to save his own miserable life, of betraying his own brothers and his holy order. He retracted everything. He swore before God and man that the order was pure, just, and holy. The confessions were lies, the accusations a slander. "I see before me my final judgment," he cried out, his voice ringing with the conviction of a man with nothing left to lose. "And the truth is this: the order is innocent. I have committed the greatest sin by betraying it. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. This was not part of the script. Before the stunned cardinals could even react, Geoffrey de Charny, standing beside his Grand Master, found his own voice and echoed the defiance. He too recanted his confession, proclaimed the innocence of the order, and in that single, breathtaking moment, the two old men had seized control of their own ending. For 7 years, they had been pawns in a king's game, their names stained by confessions they had not written. Now, in their final hour, they reclaimed their honor. They were not repentant heretics seeking mercy. They were martyrs, choosing to die for the truth. The cardinals were paralyzed, the carefully staged ceremony in ruins. The crowd, which had gathered to witness a final humiliation, was instead watching an act of incredible, heroic courage. The king had planned a quiet end to his long campaign, but King Philip, watching from his palace nearby, heard of the Grand Master's defiance almost immediately. His reaction was not one of legal deliberation. It was one of pure, cold fury. The public spectacle he had orchestrated to be his final triumph had been turned against him. He had been challenged, publicly and spectacularly, by two old men who should have been broken. He would not allow it. He bypassed the stunned and powerless cardinals entirely. This was no longer a matter. Consulting with his own council, Philip made an immediate decision. Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny, having recanted their confessions, were relapsed heretics. The punishment was death. There would be no more trials, no more appeals, no more delays. The sentence would be carried out that as the evening light began to fade over Paris, a pyre was hastily built on a small, sandy island in the middle of the river Seine, a place known as the Île aux Juifs. It was a stark and lonely stage, visible to the crowds that now gathered silently on the riverbanks and bridges, watching the grim preparations. De Molay and de Charny were brought to the island. They were calm, resolute. The fear that had haunted them for 7 years was gone. They had spoken their truth, and now they were bound to the stake, and the executioners were given a specific command from the king. This was not to be a quick death. The fire was to be built slowly, with green wood, to prolong their agony. It was a final, vindictive act of cruelty from a king as the flames began to lick at their feet. It is said that Jacques de Molay raised his voice one last time. In the gathering dusk, his words carried across the water to the horrified onlookers. He proclaimed the innocence of his order and the injustice of their fate. And then he issued his now famous curse. He summoned both King Philip and Pope Clement, the two men responsible for his doom, to meet him before the judgment of God. The Pope, he declared, he and Charny faced the flames with incredible fortitude, their eyes reportedly fixed on the great towers of Notre Dame until the very end. They died not as heretics, but as martyrs. Their slow, agonizing death was meant to be the final word in the Templar affair, a brutal symbol of royal power. But it was not an ending. It was a beginning. The story of their defiant deaths and the Grand Master's curse spread like wildfire across Europe, and the Knights Templar, erased from the ledgers of the Church, while the fires in Paris cast a long and terrible shadow. The fate of the Knights Templar was not a uniform story across all of Christendom. In other kingdoms, where the hand of King Philip did not hold such a powerful sway, The saga of the Templars unfolded with far less brutality and far more skepticism. Let us turn our attention across the Channel to England under the rule of King Edward II. Edward was Philip's son-in-law, and he received the same urgent letters from the French king, filled with tales of heresy and demonic rituals. Initially, Edward was doubtful. He knew the Templars of England. They were not a shadowy cabal. They were powerful landowners, trusted advisors, and an integral part of the English aristocracy. He wrote to the Pope, expressing his disbelief in the lurid accusations. However, the pressure from both the French crown and eventually the Pope himself, through the bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, became too great to ignore. In early 1308, with clear reluctance, but the process in England was a world away from the nightmare that had unfolded in France. There were no dawn raids by royal commandos, no mass imprisonments in torturous dungeons. The arrests were handled by local sheriffs and were, for the most part, polite affairs. Knights were placed under a form of house arrest in their own preceptories or confined to castles. But they were not, as a rule, thrown into chains or subjected to the horrors their French brethren had endured. Torture was not a standard part of English common law, and while the Pope had authorized its use for the trials, its application was sporadic and met with considerable resistance from English officials, who saw it as a foreign. The trials themselves dragged on for years. Without the systematic use of torture to produce swift confessions, the case against the English Templars floundered. The knights vehemently and consistently maintained their innocence. They denied spitting on the cross. They denied worshiping idols, and they denied the charges of immorality. The evidence presented against them was flimsy, often amounting to little more than village gossip or the testimony of rival monastic orders who stood to gain from their downfall. Witnesses were brought in who claimed to have heard rumors of strange goings-on. In the end, the English trials concluded not with a bang, but with a whimper. Unable to prove the sensational charges of heresy, the inquisitors focused instead on more minor, believable sins. Some knights admitted under pressure that they had been absolved of their sins by the Grand Master instead of a priest, a technical infringement of canon law. On the basis of these minor absolutions, they were reconciled with the Church. There were no burnings at the stake, no mass executions. The English Templars were found to be misguided, perhaps, but not heretics. The order was dissolved as per the Pope's decree, and the knights were sent to live out their days in various monasteries, on a modest pension. Their lands and assets were eventually, after much delay and royal skimming, turned over to the Hospitallers. The English chapter of the story in a kingdom where the process was even remotely fair. The case for heresy simply collapsed. If the Templar story in England was one of reluctance, in the Iberian Peninsula, the kingdoms of Portugal, Castile, and Aragon, it was one of outright defiance. Here, on the front lines of the centuries-long Reconquista against the Muslim Moors, the Templars were not seen as arrogant international bankers. They were revered as grizzled, battle-hardened heroes who had been instrumental in defending and expanding the borders of Christendom. The idea that these men were secret heretics was met not just with skepticism. When the Pope's order to arrest the knights arrived, the Iberian monarchs found themselves in a difficult position. They were loyal sons of the Church, but they were also pragmatic rulers who relied heavily on the Templars' military strength. In the Kingdom of Aragon, King James II obeyed the papal command, but he did so with a heavy heart. He laid siege to Templar castles, not because he believed them guilty, but because it was a direct order from the Pope. The Templars, in turn, defended themselves, leading to armed standoffs. They were not fighting their king, they argued. They were resisting an unjust accusation. The subsequent trials in Aragon were long and thorough, and in the end, the knights were overwhelmingly declared innocent of all charge. The story was similar in Castile. But it was in Portugal that the most creative and telling solution was found. King Denis. I had no intention of destroying the most effective fighting force in his kingdom, nor did he intend to let their vast land holdings and castles fall into the hands of the Knights Hospitaller, an order with international loyalties. He played a brilliant political game. He agreed to the trials, which, like in Spain, ultimately found the Portuguese Templars innocent. But instead of simply letting them go, he negotiated with the Pope. He argued that Portugal still had a crusade. In 1319, with papal approval, King Denis I created a new, uniquely Portuguese military order, the Military Order of Christ. And into this new order, he transferred all the men, assets, castles, and traditions of the former Knights Templar in Portugal. It was a seamless transition, a rebranding of pure genius. The Templars of Portugal didn't fall. They were simply reborn under a new name, their wealth and purpose intact, now sworn to the Portuguese crown. The iconic Red Cross of the Templars was even adapted, becoming the symbol of the new Order of Christ. It was this cross that would adorn the sails of Portuguese ships during the Age of Discovery, carried across the globe by explorers. The fate of the Templars in Iberia demonstrates, once again, that their downfall was not a theological inevitability, but a political one. In kingdoms where they were still seen as militarily essential, where their purpose had not been made redundant by the end of the Crusades in the East, the accusations of heresy were seen as the French political maneuvering they truly were. The kings of Spain and Portugal were strong enough and valued the Templars enough to resist Philip's narrative. In doing so, they not only saved the lives of the knights in their lands, but also preserved a crucial part of their legacy. The grand narrative of the Templars often focuses on the dramatic fates of its leaders, the defiance of Jacques de Molay, the politics of popes and kings. But the order was made up of thousands of men whose stories are rarely told. What happened to the common Templar, the ordinary knight, the sergeant, the chaplain, or the craftsman who had dedicated his life to the order, only to see it vanish overnight? Their fates were as varied as the lands in which they lived. For many, the dissolution of the order meant a life of forced retirement. In England, Spain, and other regions where they were found innocent or reconciled with the Church, the former knights were assigned to various monasteries to live out their days. They were given a small pension, drawn from the former assets of their own order, and were expected to live as quasi-monastic boarders. Imagine the quiet melancholy of this existence. A man who had once been a warrior, a diplomat, or a master of finance was now reduced to a life of quiet prayer and reflection in a Benedictine or Cistercian house. Surrounded by monks who may have viewed him with suspicion or pity, he would still wear a cross, but it was the cross of a fallen order, a quiet reminder. In France, where the persecution had been most severe, the fate of the lower-ranking members was often harsher. Those who had confessed to heresy and had not recanted were also frequently sent to monasteries, but under much stricter penance. Many bore the physical and psychological scars of their interrogation for the rest of their lives. They were the lucky ones. Hundreds, if not thousands, had died during the initial years of the trial from torture, from disease in the squalid dungeons. Other Templars simply disappeared. Some, particularly the sergeants and non-military members who were less conspicuous, may have shed their Templar identity and melted back into civilian life, becoming farmers, merchants, or laborers, their pasts a closely guarded secret. It is this quiet dispersal that has fueled so many of the enduring Templar legends. Did they flee to Scotland, a kingdom at the time excommunicated and at war with England, and thus a safe haven? Did they use their fleet to sail to the New World? Centuries before Columbus, these stories are romantic. The story of the common Templar is one of profound loss. These were men who had joined an order that promised them salvation and a life of purpose. They had surrendered their personal wealth, their family ties, and their very identities to the Brotherhood. When the order was dissolved, they were left with nothing. They were men without a mission, without a leader, and without a home. Their quiet, scattered fates are the final, human tragedy of the Templar story, a stark reminder that when great institutions fall, it is the ordinary members who are often left adrift in the wreckage, their individual stories lost in the grand. In the center of this tragic web sat one man, whose decisions sealed the Templars' fate, yet whose own power seemed, at times, illusory: Pope Clement V. His legacy is forever entwined with the destruction of the order, and he is often remembered as a weak, vacillating pope, a puppet of the French king. But the truth of his situation was far more complex, a study in the agonizing compromises of power. Clement was a man caught in a political storm he could not control, and his actions were those of a leader trying to navigate a path. When Philip first moved against the Templars, Clement's outrage was genuine. The king had trampled upon centuries of papal privilege. The Templars were the Pope's men, and to arrest them was a direct assault on his authority. His initial attempts to wrest control of the trials were a clear signal that he would not simply rubber stamp the king's actions. He suspended the French Inquisition, established his own commissions, and demanded the prisoners and their property be turned over to the church. For a time, it seemed he was mounting a defense, not necessarily of the Templars themselves, but Clement was playing a weak hand. He was a Frenchman, residing not in the fortified independence of Rome, but in Avignon, a stone's throw from Philip's sphere of influence. He was also a pragmatist. He knew the character of the king he was dealing with. This was the same Philip who had effectively kidnapped Clement's predecessor, Boniface VIII, an act that had left the old pope so traumatized he had died shortly after. Philip had proven he was willing to use violence against the person of the Pope himself. The threat, though unspoken, was always there. Furthermore, Philip's propaganda campaign was incredibly effective, with hundreds of knights confessing under torture. Clement was faced with a public relations nightmare. If he exonerated the Templars, he could be accused of protecting a nest of heretics, a charge that could shatter His final decision at the Council of Vienne to suppress the order without formally condemning it for heresy was a masterpiece of political calculation. It was an admission of defeat, but a carefully worded one. In the Bull Vox in Excelso, he explicitly states that a canonical trial had not found them guilty, but that the scandal surrounding them was too great for the order to continue. He sacrificed the Templars to prevent a much larger schism with the French crown. Did he regret it? We can never truly know. But his actions suggest a man deeply troubled by the affair. He fought for years, not to save the Templars, but to save the process, to ensure the end came via his authority, not the king's. In the end, he was forced to choose the lesser of two evils. Perhaps the most telling postscript is his death. He died just over a month after de Molay's execution, suffering from a terrible illness. To the people of Europe, this was not a coincidence. It was the hand of God, the first part of the Grand Master's curse come true. History remembers Clement V not as a villain, but as a tragic figure, a pope whose reign was defined by the long, dark shadow of a ruthless King Philip the Fair got everything he wanted. He had crushed a powerful rival, canceled his debts, and seized an immense fortune. He had asserted the absolute authority of the French crown over even the most powerful religious orders. He had stared down the Pope and won. On the surface, his campaign against the Templars was a stunning success, a masterclass in ruthless political maneuvering. But victory, especially one built on such a foundation of injustice, often comes at a price. Philip's triumph was a hollow one, and the years following the Templars' destruction would suggest that the vast Templar treasure, which Philip had gone to such lengths to acquire, did little to solve his kingdom's underlying financial problems. The wealth was squandered on his endless wars and the machinery of his expanding state. The economic relief was temporary, a short-term fix that did not address the systemic issues plaguing the French economy. In the long run, his brutal methods, including the debasement of the currency and the expulsion of Jewish and Lombard bankers, had damaged France's commercial reputation and created instability that would last for decades. He had won the battle for the Templar gold, but he was losing the... Then came the matter of his own fate. In November 1314, less than 8 months after Jacques de Molay had been burned at the stake, Philip IV suffered a cerebral stroke while on a hunting trip and died shortly after. He was only 46 years old. To a medieval populace that believed deeply in divine judgment, the connection was inescapable. The Grand Master had summoned the king to God's tribunal within the year. The perceived curse did not end with Philip. It seemed to cling to his entire lineage. He left behind 3 healthy, capable sons to secure the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 3 centuries. But one by one, they would fall. His eldest son, Louis the Kex, died after only 2 years on the throne. His successor, Philip V, also died young after a short reign. The last of Philip's sons, Charles IV, died without a male heir in 1328. With his death, the direct line of the Capetian dynasty was extinguished. This succession crisis led directly to a claim on the French throne by King Edward III of England, a claim that would ignite the devastating 100 Years' War, a conflict that would tear France apart. Looking back, the destruction of the Templars was not the beginning of a glorious new era for the French monarchy, but the prelude to a century of chaos, war, and dynastic collapse. Philip IV had centralized power and asserted the dominance of the state, but his legacy was one of turmoil. He had built a house on a foundation of lies and blood, and that house could not stand. Whether you believe in curses or simply in the unforeseen consequences of history, the fall of the House of Capet, so soon after the fall of the Temple, stands as a final, dark, and ironic chapter in the story of a king who won a spectacular victory. When the Templar order was shattered, more was lost than just land and gold. An immense body of knowledge, accumulated over 2 centuries of unprecedented international operation, was effectively dispersed to the winds. The Templars were not just warriors and bankers. They were master logisticians, administrators, diplomats, and, some would argue, guardians of secrets that went far beyond financial ledgers. The sudden collapse of their centralized network represented a profound loss of institutional memory, Consider their practical knowledge. They had pioneered techniques in resource management, running thousands of agricultural estates with remarkable efficiency. They had a deep understanding of international finance, creating complex systems of credit and transfer that were unparalleled in their time. They were master builders, their castles in the Holy Land representing the pinnacle of military architecture. They possessed a fleet of ships and an intimate knowledge of Mediterranean sea lanes, essential for trade and transport. When the order was dissolved, this vast practical expertise was not neatly transferred to the Hospitallers or anyone else. It was fragmented. The men who held this knowledge were scattered, imprisoned, or killed. The central archives, particularly those in Paris, were seized by Philip's men. While financial records were of interest to the king, it's likely that much of the administrative and this leads to the more speculative and legendary side of their lost knowledge. The Templars had spent 200 years headquartered on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, a site of immense religious and historical significance. Legends abound that during their excavations and constructions there, they discovered documents or artifacts from the time of King Solomon, or even earlier. These are the stories that speak of the Templars finding the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or secret God. There is no concrete historical evidence for any of this, of course, but the theory that they guarded a secret, be it a spiritual truth or a physical treasure, is a powerful one, and it helps to explain the ferocity of their persecution. Perhaps the charges of heresy were not a complete fabrication, but a twisted reflection of a real but misunderstood secret doctrine they possessed. When the order was broken, what happened to this secret knowledge? Did it die with the last knights who were burned at the stake? Or was it... This idea of lost secrets is central to the Templar myth. The image of a few loyal knights escaping with sacred scrolls, a hidden map, or the key to an ancient mystery is an irresistible one. It transforms them from victims into guardians, and their fall into a successful preservation of something vital. It is likely that the Templars' only secret was their innovative system of banking, but the sudden, violent end of such a powerful and secretive organization created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, for the next 700 years, people would pour their own theories, hopes, and suspicions, creating a legend of lost knowledge that is far more compelling than any simple. While Jacques de Molay's defiant death gave rise to a romantic legend of martyrdom, the accusations leveled by King Philip gave birth to something else entirely, a black legend that would cling to the Templars' name for centuries. The propaganda campaign was so successful, so vivid, and so deeply ingrained into the public consciousness that the stain of heresy never truly washed away. Even for those who believed the knights were innocent of the charges, the sheer horror. The most enduring and infamous part of this black legend is the idol, Baphomet. This mysterious figure, which the Templars were accused of worshipping, became synonymous with their name. The image of a demonic, goat-headed, androgynous deity, as later imagined by occultists like Eliphas Levi in the 19th century, has its roots in the Templar trials. Though no such idol was ever found, and the name itself was likely a misunderstanding or a deliberate invention by the Inquisitors, Baphomet became the ultimate symbol of the Templars' supposed secret depravity. The name itself was a powerful tool of propaganda, sounding just foreign and sinister enough to be believable. The charges of blasphemy and immoral rituals also had a long and poisonous afterlife. The idea of knights spitting on the cross became a potent symbol of secret betrayal, of an institution that was holy on the outside but rotten within. This narrative of hypocrisy was incredibly powerful. It fed into a growing public cynicism about powerful religious institutions, a sentiment that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation. The Templars became a cautionary tale, a symbol of how even the most revered organ. For centuries after their dissolution, the official story, as sanctioned by the Church and state, was one of guilt. Chronicles and histories repeated the charges as fact. The Templars were often portrayed in popular culture not as heroes, but as cautionary figures, a testament to the dangers of pride and secret sin. It was only much later, during the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, that historians began to seriously re-examine the evidence and dismantle the case against them, recasting them as the tragic victims of royal. But the Black Legend never fully died. It proved too compelling, too exciting. To this day, the Templars occupy a strange dual space in our collective imagination. They are simultaneously seen as pious martyrs and as the guardians of dark, heretical secrets. They are heroes in some stories and villains in others. This enduring ambiguity is perhaps the ultimate testament to the success of Philip's campaign. He did not just destroy the order. He managed to permanently muddy the waters of their history, creating a narrative so powerful that it continues to compete with the truth 700 years later. The Baphomet, the obscene kiss, the denial of Christ, these were lies, but they were lies that took on a life of their own, creating a dark and fascinating shadow. And so, the flames on that small island in the Seine died down, leaving behind only ashes and a story that would refuse to be forgotten. As we sit here now, in the quiet of our own time, we are left with the same question that has haunted historians for 700 years. Were the Knights Templar truly guilty? Was their celebrated order, in its final years, a secret haven for heresy and blasphemy? There are some who might argue that where there is smoke, there is fire. The order was secretive. Its initiation rituals performed behind closed doors, hidden from the eyes of the public. It is possible that over 2 centuries, some of its practices could have become corrupted, their original symbolic meanings lost or twisted. The loss of the Holy Land, their very reason for being, could have created a deep crisis of faith and morale within the ranks, leading some knights down a cynical or unorthodox path. The consistency of some of the details in the forced confessions has led a few to wonder if there might have been a small, but the weight of evidence points overwhelmingly in the other direction. It points not to a crisis of faith within the Templar order, but to a conspiracy of debt orchestrated by the French crown. Consider King Philip's history, a monarch in perpetual financial crisis who had already shown a clear pattern of targeting, defaming, and seizing the assets of wealthy minority groups. The Templars were simply the wealthiest and most tempting target yet. Consider the methods: the perfectly synchronized kingdom-wide arrests, the immediate seizure of property by royal agents, and the use of systematic torture designed to produce the exact confessions the king needed to hear. This was not the careful, if severe, work of a religious inquisition. It was the swift, brutal efficiency of a state-sponsored corporate takeover. In the end, their crime was their wealth, their independence, and their unfortunate position as the creditors to a king who had no intention of paying his debts. Their story is a timeless and chilling lesson in how easily the sacred can be weaponized by the secular, and how quickly the story of the Templars' fall is more than just a tale of greed and betrayal. It is a landmark event in the history of Europe. Their destruction marks a pivotal turning point, a violent and dramatic shift away from the old medieval world and toward the new, modern one. The Templars, in many ways, were a perfect symbol of the Middle Ages. They were a transnational organization whose loyalties and identity transcended borders. They were a product of a world where the Church, in the form of the papacy, was the supreme international power, a force that could command kings and whose authority, in theory, was absolute. The Templars were the Pope's private army, and their existence was a physical manifestation. King Philip's successful annihilation of the order was a declaration that this old way of life was over. His actions were a powerful assertion of the primacy of the nation-state. He demonstrated that a determined monarch, using the centralized bureaucracy and legal machinery of his own kingdom, could successfully defy the Pope and destroy a powerful international body that stood in his way. He essentially privatized heresy, turning a religious crime into a tool of state policy. In doing so, he provided a blueprint for future rulers. He showed that royal power, not papal authority. Before the Templars, Europe was a patchwork of overlapping loyalties to a local lord, to a distant king, and to a universal church. After the Templars, the lines became much clearer. The nation, personified by the king, was becoming the ultimate object of loyalty. The idea of France, of England, of Spain as unified, centralized states with absolute control over everything within their territory, was taking hold. The Templars, an order that belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time, were an anomaly that could not be allowed to exist in this new political landscape. Their fiery end was not just the death of a single religious order, it was a signal that the age of universal papal power was waning, and the age of the sovereign. The story of the Templars is also a timeless masterclass in the terrifying power of propaganda. Before King Philip could seize their assets, he first had to destroy their reputation. Their greatest shield was not their castles or their swords, but the immense goodwill they had built up over 2 centuries. They were widely seen as the heroes of Christendom, pious and brave defenders of the faith. To attack them directly would have been unthinkable. So, the list of charges leveled against the Templars was a work of malevolent genius. It was not just a list of crimes. It was a narrative weapon, precisely engineered to exploit the deepest fears and prejudices of the medieval mind. The accusations of spitting on the cross, of worshiping a demonic head, of secret homosexual rituals, these were designed to be shocking, memorable, and easily spread. They were simple, lurid, and almost impossible to disprove. How do you prove you don't worship a secret idol, the very secrecy of the order, once a source of its mystique and strength was turned against them? This official narrative was then amplified by the brute force of the state. The forced confessions, extracted under the agony of torture, were not kept secret. They were read aloud in public squares, distributed to universities, and sent to every court in Europe. They were the evidence, the proof that turned rumor into fact. The sight of dozens of knights confessing to these terrible sins, including the Grand Master himself, created a powerful feedback loop. The public heard the accusations. Then it demonstrates a chilling truth that a lie, when repeated loudly enough and endorsed by a powerful authority, can become more real than the truth itself. The Templars' centuries of service, their spilled blood in the Holy Land, their reputation for integrity, all of it was erased in a few short years by a well-told and relentlessly promoted lie. Their fall is a stark reminder that the battle for public opinion is often more decisive than any battle fought on a field, and that a reputation, no matter how strongly built, can be swiftly and utterly demolished by a powerful narrative. And yet, despite the king's victory, despite the official dissolution by the Pope, the story of the Templars refused to end. In fact, their physical destruction was the very thing that guaranteed their immortality. In death, they became more powerful than they ever were in life, transforming from a historical institution into a potent and enduring myth. The final, defiant curse of Jacques de Molay on his funeral pyre became the catalyst. Whether by coincidence or by the hand of divine retribution, Pope Clement V was dead within a month of the execution, suffering from a vicious intestinal disease. By the end of the year, King Philip IV also met his end, killed by a stroke suffered during a hunting trip. This dramatic fulfillment of the Grand Master's prophecy cemented the idea that the Templars were not heretics, but wronged men, and that powerful, hidden forces were at work. And with that, the legends began. Whispers started to spread of a surviving Templar fleet, laden with the Order's immense treasure and the Holy Grail itself, that had slipped out of the port of La Rochelle the night before the arrests and vanished into the unknown. Stories emerged of knights who had escaped the purge. Over the centuries, the void left by their sudden disappearance was filled by countless theories and speculations. They became a kind of historical phantom, a blank canvas onto which later generations could project their own hopes and fears. In the 18th century, the newly formed Freemasons adopted Templar rituals and symbols, claiming a direct, unbroken lineage back to Jacques de Molay, lending their own fraternity an ancient and mysterious allure. In the modern era, they have become central figures in a sprawling web of conspiracy theories, linked to everything from the Rosicrucians and the Illuminati to the location of the lost Ark of the Covenant. They are the heroes of best-selling novels and blockbuster films, their white mantles with the Red Cross now a universally recognized symbol of secret history and hidden power. The question of what they truly were has been almost entirely eclipsed by them, and perhaps that is their final, ironic victory. The king who tried to erase them from history only succeeded in carving their story into the heart of Western mythology, ensuring, let the story settle now. Let the kings and the popes, the accusations and the curses, all begin to fade, like a dream you can't quite hold on to upon waking. Let's return for a final moment to that small, lonely island in the middle of the River Seine. The crowds have long since dispersed, gone home to whisper about the terrible and incredible thing they just witnessed. The sun has set completely, and a deep quiet has fallen. All that remains on the island is the dying pyre. The angry, roaring flames have softened into a deep, orange glow, a bed of embers pulsing softly in the darkness. An occasional spark flickers and dies, a final, fleeting echo of the defiance that lit up the dusk. The smoke, which once carried the prayers of the dying knights, has thinned to a pale, ghostly haze that drifts slowly over the dark water and vanishes into the night sky. The heat of that final, brutal act of power is gone, replaced by the cool peace of the evening. The end of the Knights Templar was not a grand, crashing crescendo. It was a slow, quiet fade to black, the last embers of a once great fire glowing silently in the heart of the city, before winking out. One by one, the men are gone, their order erased from the official books of the church, their wealth scattered to the winds. And yet, they did not vanish completely. If you know where to look, you can still find them, silent and patient, waiting in the quiet corners of Europe. They are not in the stories or the legends, but in the cold, hard. Picture a small, circular church on a busy London street, its ancient form strangely out of place amidst the modern city. This is the Temple Church, their English headquarters, its round nave modeled after the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. If you step inside, away from the noise of the traffic, you can still feel the weight of their presence in the cool, still air. You can see the stone effigies of knights lying on the floor, their hands clasped in prayer, their legs crossed, a sign that they had served in the Crusades. They are weathered and worn by centuries of footsteps, but they remain silent witnesses to a forgotten oath. Or imagine a journey through the French countryside, where you might stumble upon an old, fortified farmhouse, a simple stone chapel standing beside it, its walls thicker than they need to be. This was a Templar preceptory, a place where knights once prayed before riding out to manage their lands. The grand temples in Paris and London were destroyed, but these small, humble outposts survived, absorbed into the landscape, their original purpose forgotten by the villages that grew up around them. The stones don't remember the politics or the betrayals. They simply hold the memory of the daily rhythm of life, of prayer at dawn, of horses in the stable, of men who believed they were serving God. These structures have outlasted the Kingdom of France, the Avignon papacy, and the men who condemned their... And so, their story comes to a close. It is a journey that began with a simple, noble idea to protect the faithful with a sword in one hand and a rosary in the other. They were born from the dust of the Holy Land, 9 poor knights who became an army of God. They grew into the most trusted institution in Europe, their integrity earning them a fortune they themselves could never touch. They were pioneers, creating a system of global finance that was centuries ahead of its time. They were the ultimate paradox monks who were soldiers, ascetics who were bankers, servants of the church who became, and in the end, the virtues that led to their rise became the very architects of their downfall. Their discipline made them formidable, but also feared. Their piety earned them trust, which brought them wealth, and their wealth, in turn, attracted the fatal envy of a king who could not tolerate a power greater than his own. They were not defeated on a battlefield by a worthy adversary. They were dismantled from within, brought down by a conspiracy of whispers, lies, and unimaginable cruelty. Theirs is a story that serves as a timeless, cautionary tale about the combustible nature of faith, money, and power, and how quickly heroes can be recast as villains when they stand in the way of ambition. For centuries, after the last embers cooled, their official story was one of shame. But in the silence, a different story was being carved not in stone, but in memory. A legend of betrayal, of innocence. So now, let the story go. Let the images of pyres and palaces, of knights and kings, all gently dissolve. Let them drift away like smoke, leaving behind only the quiet and the dark. The battle is over. The long, exhausting journey is done. All that is left is the deep, profound peace that follows the true treasure of the Templars was never the gold in their vaults or the jewels they guarded. Their real treasure was their story, a story of faith, of courage, and of a betrayal so deep it has echoed through centuries. And now, that story is safe. It's safe with you. You can let it go, knowing that it has been heard, there is nothing more to worry about now. No more trials to witness, no more injustice to bear. Just the gentle, rhythmic breathing in the quiet of your room. Feel the weight of the day lifting from your shoulders. Feel the world outside fading into a soft, distant murmur. You can rest, Let the darkness be a comforting blanket, a safe harbor. Sleep now. The story is over.